Picture yourself holding an invitation. Not just paper and ink, power made tangible. An engraved card that determines whether you exist or vanish in the eyes of American society. The address printed in elegant script doesn't merely indicate location. It marks the coordinates where one woman's decisions about wallpaper influence national fashion, where her seating arrangements make or break fortunes measured in millions. For 3 decades, Carolyn Astor operated from residential addresses that functioned as command centers for social control more sophisticated than any government bureau. Her ballroom capacity, exactly 400 people, defined the boundaries of acceptable society. Not metaphorically, literally. If you couldn't fit in her ballroom, you didn't exist in her world. And if you didn't exist in her world, you didn't exist in America's upper class. But here's what the histories don't tell you. These residences functioned as something beyond domestic space. They operated as precision tools, elaborately staged arenas where Carolyn Astor orchestrated her performance as society's sovereign, while attendees fought for visible positions and spectacles they could not risk missing. Her choice of address rippled outward with seismic force. Wherever she established herself, the neighborhood's character shifted overnight. New York's wealthiest families migrated in her direction with the inevitability of compass, needles seeking magnetic north. Her departure from a district triggered property devaluations and social exile. Her arrival at a new location sparked bidding wars among millionaires, willing to pay irrational premiums simply to occupy adjacent real estate. How does one woman accumulate such power that her change of address reshapes Manhattan real estate? The mansions of Caroline Astor represent more than architectural history. They're evidence. Case studies in how beauty becomes weaponized, how social codes become prisons, and how the mathematics of power eventually fail even those who seem invincible. Stand outside the Empire State Building today, and you're standing where it all began, where 400 people once determined the fate of millions. Before the palace, before the 1,000-person ballroom, before the architectural revenge that would make her nephew regret ever building a hotel, before all of that, Carolyn Astor operated from something far more dangerous than obvious grandeur. Restraint. The original Astor Mansion occupied the southwest corner of 5th Avenue and 34th Street. 4 stories of Nova Scotia brownstone, measuring 50 feet wide by 107 feet deep. Not small by any standard, but modest compared to what would come later. Modest compared to what some of her rivals were already building. The exterior whispered wealth rather than screaming it. Double stoop flanked by Corinthian columns suggesting classical education without academic pretension. Window dressings, architraves, cornices carved from freestone accents. Details that rewarded close examination, but didn't demand attention. A walled garden separating the property from the neighboring mansion where William's brother lived, creating a family compound that announced dynasty without vulgarity. This was old money strategy. The Schermerhorn-Astor alliance represented 2 of New York's most established families. The Schermerhorns traced lineage back to Dutch colonial settlement, not just wealth, but generational legitimacy. The Astors provided something equally valuable. Real estate holdings so vast that Carolyn as father-in-law could give prime. Manhattan parcels as wedding presents, the way normal parents give silverware. In 1854, William Backhouse Astor Sr. gifted his son William Jr. and new daughter-in-law, Carolyn Webster Schermerhorn, this 5th Avenue lot. The couple constructed their residence in 1862, timing their building precisely as 5th Avenue transformed from country road into America's most prestigious address. The location itself demonstrated the family's understanding that Manhattan would expand northward, that patience in real estate generates fortunes that speculation only dreams of achieving. But the mansion's power lay not in its exterior. Enter through those mahogany doors, and you encountered something more calculated than mere luxury. A wide entrance hall designed to process arrivals efficiently, not intimate, but operationally precise. 3 connected drawing rooms where Mrs. Astor received guests while standing before her. Life-size portrait by Carol Astor. Notice the staging. You don't sit casually with Carolyn Astor. You approach her as she stands beneath a painted version of herself, forcing visitors to confront both the woman and her artistic immortalization simultaneously. Power through visual redundancy, making you see her twice before you've even spoken. The formal dining room began in English Regency style, but underwent transformation into glittering white and gold Louis XVI during the 1880s. The drawing room started in refined Adam style, then received an equally flamboyant makeover in rich golden rococo, with painted frescoes covering walls and ceilings. These weren't decorating limbs. Each renovation announced Caroline's evolving understanding of what social supremacy required. Start understated, then elaborate progressively as your position solidifies. Never apologize for transformation. Make each iteration seem inevitable, necessary, the only possible choice for someone of your stature. But the mansion's true power resided in one room, the ballroom. Modest by later Gilded Age standards, not the largest, not the most ornate, but it could accommodate exactly 400 guests. And this number would become synonymous with American social exclusivity for an entire generation. Not 399, not 401, 400. Here's what you need to understand about the 400. It wasn't arbitrary. It was engineered. In the 1880s, Carolyn Astor partnered with Ward McAllister, a social arbiter who'd spent years studying European aristocratic customs, to codify exactly who mattered in American society. They created a list. The 400. Supposedly, the number of people who could fit comfortably in Mrs. Astor's ballroom, though the real capacity probably exceeded that. The number mattered less than the principle. Society has limits. Caroline Astor determines those limits. If you're not on the list, you don't exist. Think about the machinery required to maintain this system. Every potential guest must be vetted. Lineage traced back at least 3 generations, not just wealth, but documented legitimacy. New money could be accepted, but only after appropriate seasoning. Raw fortunes needed time to mature, like wine that's drinkable, but not yet respectable. Mrs. Astor maintained mental files on hundreds of families. Who married whom? Which sons drank excessively? Which daughters showed unfortunate tendencies toward intellectualism or, worse, bohemianism? Which fortunes rested on stable foundations versus which balanced precariously on speculation that could collapse any season? The annual January ball became America's most coveted invitation, not because the entertainment exceeded other parties, though the food, wine, and music certainly matched anything available in Manhattan, but because attendance confirmed your existence. If you received that engraved card, if you passed through those doors on the designated evening, if you danced in that ballroom until dawn, you'd been certified as real. If you didn't, you weren't. The social season ran from November through February, and every event, every dinner, every reception, every theater outing existed in relationship to Mrs. Astor's schedule. Hostesses planned around her availability. No one held competing events on nights when she'd scheduled something. You attended her gatherings first, then filled remaining time with lesser social obligations. From this brownstone measuring 50 by 107 feet, Carolyn Astor controlled access to American high society with precision that would make modern bouncers weep with envy. But underneath the elegant parties and careful guest lists, something else operated, an empire built on invisible labor. Step past those drawing rooms where Mrs. Astor received guests, and another architecture appears. The service infrastructure required to host 400 people for an evening of dancing and dining doesn't announce itself. By design, the entire system operates invisibly, with staff moving through spaces that guests never see, along corridors that architectural photographs carefully exclude. The mansion employs a permanent staff of at least 30 people during peak social season. Housemaids earning $6 to $8 weekly, responsible for maintaining rooms that must appear perpetually pristine. Not just clean, spotless, with dust removal verging on obsessive, because a single mote floating through afternoon sunlight could suggest declining standards. Footmen at $10 to $12 weekly, trained in precise choreography of service. How to open doors with proper timing. How to announce guests with correct emphasis. How to move through rooms without being noticed, present when needed, but invisible when not. Cooks commanding slightly higher wages, $15 to $20, operating kitchens that function like military installations during events. Preparing meals for 400 requires logistics that rival small hotels. Courses timed with precision, measured in minutes, with dishes emerging from kitchens 2 floors below at temperatures that can't be allowed to vary. Laundresses, seamstresses, stable hands caring for carriages and horses. Gardeners maintaining the walled garden that separates Astor property from surrounding blocks. For the January ball alone, additional temporary staff must be hired. Extra servers, coat check attendants, musicians, florists, delivering arrangements that will last one evening, then vanish. Ice deliveries measured in tons, storing champagne and seafood at temperatures requiring constant monitoring. Coal for heating, delivered by men whose faces grow permanently blackened from handling fuel that keeps Manhattan as elite comfortably warm while they dance. Calculate the operational mathematics. 30 permanent staff at an average of $10 weekly equals $300 in wages. Multiply by 52 weeks. $15,600 annually just for regular household operation. Add the January ball's special costs, temporary staff, food, wine, flowers, musicians. Easily another $5,000 for a single evening. Then regular entertaining throughout the season, dinners, receptions, smaller gatherings, another $10,000 annually. Plus heating, lighting, maintenance, replacement of worn furnishings, property taxes, insurance on a structure containing art and objects worth hundreds of thousands. Total annual operational costs, approximately $35,000 to $40,000. When the average American worker earns less than $500 yearly, Mrs. Astor's annual household expenses exceed the lifetime earnings of many of the people who serve her. But the real cost isn't measured in dollars. Their names mostly don't survive. The housemaids who rose at 5 each morning to clean fireplaces before the family woke. The footmen who stood for hours during parties, forbidden to show fatigue or discomfort. The cooks who worked in basement kitchens where temperatures exceeded 90 degrees, even in winter, preparing meals with ingredients they'd never taste. Records occasionally offer glimpses. A laundress, age 36, dies from tuberculosis, contracted in the damp conditions of washing rooms where steam and poorly ventilated air create perfect conditions for disease. A stable hand, 24 years old, crushed when a spooked horse kicks him into a carriage wheel, breaking ribs that puncture his lung. He survives 3 days, long enough for Mrs. Astor to send a physician, more concerned about liability than compassion, and dies without family present. These deaths don't make newspapers. They're not scandals, just ordinary tragedies of working-class life in Gilded Age Manhattan. The machinery of elite society requires fuel, and sometimes that fuel is human life consumed in service of maintaining fantasies. The housemaids cleaning Mrs. Astor's ballroom couldn't afford to attend a party there even if social rules permitted. Their annual earnings wouldn't cover the cost of an appropriate gown, much less the carriage, the evening's entertainment, the expected charitable donations that attendance implicitly required. They maintain spaces designed to exclude them. Polish floors they'll never dance on. Dust chandeliers whose light will never illuminate their own celebrations. Prepare rooms for guests whose names they recognize from newspapers, but whom they never address directly, except to say, "Yes, ma'am," or "Right away, sir," in voices trained to convey deference without personality. This is the parallel architecture. Narrow service staircases connecting basement kitchens to upper floors. Passages deliberately kept unadorned. No decoration, minimal lighting, spaces designed for function rather than beauty. Routes allowing staff to move unseen, delivering meals and removing dishes without guests ever noticing the human effort behind their evening's pleasure. The 400 dance above. Hundreds work below. And the mathematics that make this possible depend on one principle. The people who create the beauty must remain invisible. The moment guests start noticing servants as individuals, as humans with names and stories, the fantasy begins cracking. Mrs. Astor understands this instinctively. She's not cruel by the standards of her class. She pays wages roughly consistent with other elite households. She sends physicians when staff fall seriously ill, though more from property protection instinct than genuine concern. She occasionally provides small bonuses during holidays. But she never questions the fundamental system. Never asks whether hosting 400 people for an evening of dancing justifies consuming in one night what her housemaids earn in months. Never considers that the marble she walks on was installed by men whose hands will never fully heal from handling stone and mortar in freezing conditions. The mansion at 34th Street operates as designed, a machine that transforms human labor and material wealth into social power, with costs carefully hidden behind elegant facades. For 3 decades, this machine functioned smoothly. Then in 1895, everything changes. Not through revolution or reform, those would come later, but through something far more Gilded Age, architectural spite. The problem begins with family. William Waldorf Astor, son of William Jr., as brother John Jacob Astor III, believes he deserves recognition as head of the Astor family. He's wealthy, educated, politically ambitious. He served as minister to Italy, run unsuccessfully for Congress, and generally conducted himself as someone destined for leadership. But Caroline Astor doesn't acknowledge his claims. In her calculation, the line of succession runs through her husband William Jr., making her son John Jacob Astor IV the family's future. William Waldorf's branch? Secondary at best. His opinions on society, on family leadership, on anything that matters, irrelevant. This drives William Waldorf toward creative retaliation. In 1893, he purchases the lot immediately adjacent to the 34th Street mansion, the property where his father had lived, conveniently available after John Jacob III's death. Instead of constructing another residence, he announces plans for a hotel. Not just any hotel. The Waldorf Hotel will be 13 stories of German Renaissance grandeur, designed by Henry Janeway Hardenberg. It will contain bedrooms, public spaces, restaurants, and ballrooms that compete directly with the city's finest establishments. It will cater to wealthy travelers and New York society figures seeking neutral territory for entertaining. And its construction will generate noise, dust, and disruption that makes living next door absolutely miserable. Caroline Astor endures the construction for 2 years. Jackhammers breaking bedrock, crews arriving before dawn, material deliveries blocking streets, dust filtering through windows, despite every attempt to seal them. The persistent presence of workers, whose rough voices and rougher manners offend sensibilities accustomed to carefully controlled domestic environments. By 1895, she's had enough. But Mrs. Astor doesn't simply move. She orchestrates what becomes the most expensive case of neighbor spite in New York history. When Caroline Astor abandons the 34th Street mansion, she signals that the neighborhood itself is finished. Society follows her north. Property values around 34th Street, once among Manhattan's most desirable addresses, begin declining almost immediately. William Waldorf's hotel, which he'd imagined as the center of New York's social life, suddenly occupies a location that elite society is actively fleeing. The revenge cuts deeper. After Caroline moves, her son John Jacob Astor IV purchases the 34th Street property and constructs the Astoria Hotel, even larger than the Waldorf, even more luxurious. The two hotels eventually merge into the Waldorf Astoria, creating a complex that dominates the block but serves a clientele increasingly defined by wealth rather than pedigree. William Waldorf, defeated, eventually moves to England and purchases a British title, becoming Viscount Astor. He'll spend the rest of his life in a country that respects inherited position, abandoning the American experiment that failed to recognize his superiority. Carolyn, meanwhile, builds something unprecedented. When Mrs. Astor decides to relocate, she doesn't look for another brownstone. Restraint served its purpose during the establishment phase. Now, with her position unassailable, she can build what her power actually requires: a palace. The new mansion will dominate the northeast corner of Fifth Avenue and 65th Street, like a Loire Valley chateau that crossed the Atlantic and decided Manhattan suited it perfectly. Not one residence, but two, separate homes for Caroline and her son John Jacob Astor IV, joined by a magnificent glass-domed entrance hall that makes the entire structure appear as unified palace. For her architect, Caroline selects Richard Morris Hunt, not just any architect, the preeminent designer of America's Gilded Age monuments. Hunt studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the first American to receive such training. He's already designed the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty, the facade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and Biltmore Estate for the Vanderbilts. More importantly, he understands what Carolyn needs: not a home, a stage. Hunt spends 3 months touring Europe for inspiration, ultimately settling on early 16th century French Renaissance chateau style, reminiscent of the Château de Blois. Construction begins in 1894 on a plot measuring 100 feet square, double the frontage of the 34th Street property. The structure rises as two mirror image residences divided by a central partition wall, but connected through shared public spaces. Caroline claims the northern half at 841 Fifth Avenue. Her son occupies the southern portion at 845th Avenue. From the street, perfect unity. Behind the facade, careful separation of domestic spheres. Mother and son maintaining independent households while presenting a unified front to society. The principal entrance leads through a domed vestibule into a hall lined with busts of Astor ancestors. Not merely decoration, these marble relatives serve as visual reminder that the family's prominence spans generations. You're not just visiting Caroline Astor, you're entering a dynasty. This opens into the spectacular marble Great Hall, 3 stories tall, dominated by a cantilevered staircase whose architectural daring announces serious wealth before guests have removed their gloves. Marble sourced from Italian quarries, selected for veining patterns that create specific visual effects. Bronze fixtures cast according to Renaissance designs Hunt discovered in European archives. A glass dome overhead allowing natural light to cascade down through 3 floors. Stand in that space and look up, everything engineered to induce awe. The scale overwhelming individual human presence. The materials outvaluing anything most visitors own. The craftsmanship visible in every detail, from the way marble blocks fit without visible seams to the precision of bronze casting that allows hinges to operate soundlessly despite their massive weight. But the mansion's true purpose reveals itself in one room, the ballroom. Located at the rear of the combined structure, accessible through both residences, capable of holding 1,200 people, 3 times the capacity of the 34th Street Ballroom. Not just larger, exponentially more powerful. The 400 no longer define society's limits. Now Caroline can host everyone who matters, plus their extended families, plus rising figures she's considering for elevation, plus foreign visitors whose presence adds international legitimacy to her American court. The dining room features black marble walls, not just dark, but genuine black marble from Belgian quarries, whose output is limited enough to make the material itself a statement. Hunting scene tapestries hang between marble panels. Floors alternate black and white marble tiles, covered with polar bear rugs whose white fur creates visual contrast that photographs well for society page coverage. A marble chimneypiece dominates one wall, carved with such detail that guests instinctively move closer to examine it, confirming what their eyes can barely process from distance. Jules Allard, the era's preeminent interior designer, responsible for countless Gilded Age mansions, creates exquisitely detailed French-style interiors that transport visitors directly to Versailles. Not reproduction, Allard uses period furniture, actual Renaissance paintings and sculptures, materials salvaged from European estates, whose owners need cash more than heritage. Every room teaches a lesson. This is what power looks like when it no longer apologizes. Hunt doesn't publish the final construction cost, but contemporary estimates suggest the combined mansions exceed $3 million, equivalent to roughly $90 million today, just for the structure. Allard's interior work adds another $1 million. Art acquisitions, paintings, sculptures, tapestries Caroline purchases to fill rooms whose scale demands museum-quality collections, easily another $1 million. Furniture, rugs, decorative objects, the custom-designed light fixtures alone, costing thousands per room. Total investment, approximately $5 to $6 million. In 1896, when the average American worker earns roughly $500 annually, calculate that mathematics. Caroline Astor's new mansion costs 12,000 times what the average worker earns in a year. If we translated that ratio to modern incomes, using $50,000 as current median, the equivalent would be a $600 million residence. But here's what the newspaper coverage doesn't mention: the human cost of construction. The project employs hundreds of workers over 3 years. Stonemasons carving marble with precision measured in millimeters, breathing stone dust that will shorten their lives through silicosis. Plasterers working overhead for hours at a time, developing neck and shoulder problems that will cripple them decades before retirement. Carpenters handling heavy beams, risking crushed fingers and worse when loads shift unexpectedly. Their names don't survive in archives. What survives? Payroll ledgers documenting weekly wages. Stonemasons earning roughly $4 daily. Good money for skilled labor, but only when work is available. Construction pauses each winter when masonry work becomes impossible in freezing temperatures. No work means no pay. No pay means families struggling through winters that seem designed to test how much hardship humans can endure before breaking. At least 2 workers die during construction. The first, a carpenter 32 years old, falls from 3rd-story scaffolding when a plank splits under his weight. He lands on stone courtyard, sustaining injuries that kill him within hours. No family found. Burial at public expense. The second, a mason's assistant, 26, crushed when a marble block slips from rigging during installation. The block weighs nearly 2 tons. Death is immediate. He leaves behind a wife and 3 children under age 7. These deaths generate no newspaper coverage. They're construction accidents, routine tragedies of industrial work in an era before safety regulations or workers' compensation. Hunt's firm pays nominal amounts to families, enough to prevent lawsuits, not enough to meaningfully support dependents. The marble in Caroline Astor's entrance hall contains, quite literally, the blood of men who died installing it. The bronze fixtures were cast in foundries where workers breathed metal particulates that would poison them gradually over decades. The glass dome overhead was assembled by glaziers working at heights where a single misstep meant death. Every palace contains 2 structures: the visible one that appears in photographs, and the invisible one made of human cost. The mansion opens in 1896 to universal acclaim. From 1896 until Mrs. Astor's death in 1908, the Fifth Avenue Palace functions as headquarters of American high society. The massive ballroom hosts elaborate entertainments for up to 1,200 guests. though Caroline rarely invites quite that many, preferring to maintain some exclusivity even within the expanded capacity. The bronze-domed reception hall features fountains with spouting dolphins and infant Neptune sculptures, creating suitably theatrical entrances for arrivals. Winter social season becomes entirely organized around Mrs. Astor's schedule. Her Monday evening receptions occur weekly from November through March, with invitations considered mandatory attendance for anyone claiming social relevance. Missing one without legitimate excuse, death in family, serious illness, being physically out of the country signals either falling from favor or never having possessed it to begin with. The January ball grows even more elaborate than 34th Street versions. Orchestras numbering 50 or more musicians. Champagne imported directly from French producers who consider Mrs. Astor's order guaranteed annual sale. Food prepared by chefs trained in European kitchens, creating menus that span 12 courses and require industrial-scale kitchen operations. Contemporary newspapers cover these events extensively, describing gowns in detail that allows readers to virtually attend through prose. Caroline wears jewels whose value exceeds most attendees' annual incomes, diamond necklaces, tiaras, brooches each containing stones whose individual worth could support working families for years. She knows exactly what she's doing. Every public appearance performs a function, demonstrating that social position requires appropriate material display. Not merely wealth, but wealth wielded with specific aesthetic codes. New money attempting to buy entrance through ostentatious spending without understanding proper forms gets excluded. Old money that's decayed into shabby gentility also fails to meet standards. You must have wealth and know how to deploy it correctly. Caroline serves as arbiter of correct deployment. The mansion itself becomes tourist attraction. Not open to public, absolutely not, but famous enough that visitors to Manhattan make pilgrimages to Fifth Avenue and 65th Street, standing on sidewalks across the street, staring at the chateau that houses America's Queen. Guidebooks mention it prominently. Postcards feature its exterior. Newspaper illustrations depict its interiors, allowing readers across the country to imagine the spaces where society's elite gather. For 12 years, Caroline Astor operates at absolute peak power. Her guest lists determine who matters. Her fashion choices influence what women across America purchase. Her interior design decisions affect furniture and fabric sales nationwide. Manufacturers advertise products as similar to those in Mrs. Astor's drawing room. But underneath the glittering parties and unchallenged supremacy, pressures accumulate. Here's what the society pages don't report. The mansion costs approximately $75,000 annually to operate, not including special events, not including art acquisitions or furniture replacement or major repairs. Just baseline costs of keeping the structure functional and properly staffed. Caroline employs a permanent household staff exceeding 50 people during social season. Housemaids, footmen, cooks, laundresses, seamstresses, ladies' maids, valets, stable hands, gardeners, kitchen staff, night watchmen. Wages alone, roughly $30,000 annually. Add heating costs, coal measured in tons, delivered weekly during winter months. Lighting, gas fixtures throughout most of the house, with electrical systems in public rooms requiring dedicated generators. Water, massive consumption for laundries, kitchens, bathrooms, serving both residents and dozens of staff members. Maintenance, constant repairs to plumbing, painting, carpet replacement, upholstery refresh, window cleaning, masonry pointing, roof work, drainage systems. Insurance, premiums on a structure valued at several $1 million, containing art worth additional millions, with liability coverage for staff and guests. Property taxes, assessed against combined real estate and improvement values that make this one of Manhattan's most expensive parcels. $75,000 yearly when the average American family survives on less than $800. The Astor fortune can support this easily. William Astor's real estate holdings generate rental income measured in millions annually. The family wealth accumulated over 4 generations provides cushion that allows Caroline to spend without concerning herself with budgets or constraints that govern normal people's lives. But wealth isn't the only resource being consumed. By 1905, Caroline Astor is 74 years old. She's maintained her position through force of will and strategic brilliance for 3 decades. Every Monday reception requires performance, standing for hours, greeting guests individually, remembering names and family connections, and appropriate conversational topics for hundreds of people. The January ball demands months of planning, with details Caroline personally approves or rejects. The social machinery she created requires constant operation. Miss one Monday reception and rumors circulate about health decline. Cancel the January ball and speculation begins about whether her reign is ending. Show any sign of weakening in rivals. Younger women married to newer fortunes start positioning themselves as potential successors. Caroline understands that power maintained through personal presence can only survive as long as the person does. Her husband William died in 1892, leaving her technically in mourning, but practically freed from even the minimal constraints a spouse imposed. Her son, John Jacob Astor IV, manages the family's business interests, but defers to his mother on social matters, understanding that her judgment has proven consistently accurate. But maintaining this empire becomes progressively exhausting. The mansion itself weighs on her. So many rooms requiring so many decisions. Staff managing other staff, with Caroline ultimately responsible for household operation that resembles corporate management more than domestic arrangement. The constant presence of servants, necessary for function, but implicitly intrusive, meaning she's never truly alone, even in her own residence. By 1906, she begins withdrawing slightly. Fewer Monday receptions, smaller guest lists, more delegation to daughter-in-law Ava, who's married to John Jacob IV and represents the next generation of Astor women. Contemporary observers notice the shift. Newspaper coverage becomes more retrospective, describing Mrs. Astor's past triumphs more than present activities. Society figures start paying attention to other hostesses, testing whether Caroline's authority remains absolute or whether opportunities exist for rival power centers. The mathematics of human endurance, like the mathematics of wealth, eventually reach their limits. October 30th, 1908. Caroline Astor dies at her Fifth Avenue mansion, age 78. The cause listed as heart failure, though contemporary accounts suggest general decline, body and mind gradually failing after years of relentless performance. Her death doesn't merely remove a person. It eliminates the central organizing principle of American high society. For 30 years, Caroline's judgment defined social acceptability. Her guest lists determined who existed. Her Monday receptions provided the calendar around which other events organized themselves. Her January ball served as the season's inevitable peak. Without her, who decides? The answer proves to be nobody in quite the same way. Social authority fragments among multiple hostesses. Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish, Mrs. O.H.P. Belmont, Mrs. Herman Oelrichs, each commands influence, but none possesses Caroline's absolute power. Society becomes more fluid, less rigidly hierarchical, more open to new money, willing to spend extravagantly. Some consider this democratization. Others see it as decay. John Jacob Astor IV inherits the mansion. After appropriate mourning period, he converts the double residence into a single home by removing the central partition wall. The changes reflect his different approach to society, less interested in maintaining his mother's court, more focused on business ventures and personal interests. The ballroom that once hosted 1,200 guests sits increasingly empty. Monday receptions cease. The January ball tradition ends. The mansion remains physically impressive, but its social function evaporates, along with the woman who gave it purpose. In 1912, John Jacob Astor foreboards the RMS Titanic for its maiden voyage. He dies when the ship sinks, age 47, among the wealthiest casualties of history's most famous maritime disaster. His young pregnant wife Madeline survives, creating scandal that Caroline would have managed with ruthless efficiency, but which now simply unfolds as tabloid entertainment. The mansion passes to Astor's son Vincent, who inherits at age 21. Young, wealthy, uninterested in maintaining his grandmother's social traditions. He lives in the mansion sporadically, using it more as prestigious address than functioning home. By 1925, the building's fate is sealed, not through disaster or financial failure, but through simple obsolescence. Fifth Avenue has moved further uptown. The Upper East Side has become the fashionable location. The mansion at 65th Street, once at society's vanguard, now occupies territory that's commercially valuable, but socially past its peak. Vincent sells the property to a real estate developer for $2.5 million. A structure that cost $5 to $6 million to build and furnish trades for less than half its construction expense 30 years later. The developer isn't buying a home. He's buying a lot whose value lies in what can be built after demolition. Demolition begins in 1926. Destroying the mansion takes approximately 8 months. Not because the structure resists. Masonry and marble eventually yield to jackhammers and wrecking equipment, but because salvage operations come first. Everything with potential resale value must be carefully removed before serious demolition begins. The marble in the Great Hall, carefully extracted, cut into transportable sizes, sold to other builders or dealers, who resell to clients seeking authentic materials for their own construction projects. The bronze fixtures removed, melted down for metal content, or sold intact to collectors who appreciate craftsmanship independent of context. The wood paneling from drawing rooms, pulled away from walls, sorted by quality, sold piece by piece to architectural salvage dealers. The glass dome, dismantled pane by pane, with undamaged sections sold separately. Even the limestone exterior facing, removed block by block, with the finest pieces sold for reuse, the rest crushed into aggregate. The salvage operation recovers perhaps 10 to 15% of the original construction cost. The rest becomes rubble. Marble that can't be cleanly extracted gets smashed. Plaster cast aside as worthless. Most of the wood, those miles of interior trim, the frames around doors and windows, burned or hauled to dumps. Metal fixtures too damaged or too ordinary to merit salvage treatment, scrapped by weight rather than artistry. The site clears over those 8 months, and by 1927, construction begins on a new building. Not a mansion, not a hotel, but an apartment house called the 845th Avenue Building. 8 stories of residential units designed to maximize rental income from a location that remains prestigious, even if no longer supreme. Within a year, most New Yorkers passing by have forgotten what stood there previously. The chateau that housed America's queen exists only in photographs, in society page archives, in memories of people who attended those legendary parties, and in the silent testimony of invisible workers. But before we conclude, we need to acknowledge something the architectural histories consistently omit. Who actually paid for Caroline Astor's empire? Yes, the Astor fortune funded construction and operations. But money alone doesn't capture the full cost. The housemaids who rose at 5 each morning for 30 years, what did those decades of invisible labor cost them? The marriages they couldn't pursue because living in service left no time for courtship? The children they couldn't have because pregnancy meant job loss? The educations they couldn't access because wages barely covered necessities, leaving nothing for self-improvement? Their names don't survive. What survives? Generalized wage data, job categories in census records, occasional mentions in household account books. Paid housemaid wages, $6.50 weekly. Not a name, not a story. Just a line item in ledgers nobody preserved because servants' identities seemed irrelevant compared to the objects they maintained. The cooks who prepared meals for 1,200 guests, their hands scarred from knife work and burns, their bodies aged prematurely from working in basement kitchens where temperatures exceeded 100 degrees during summer parties. What happened to them when they became too old, too injured, too slow to meet mansion standards? Fired, replaced, left to survive on savings that service wages made nearly impossible to accumulate. The construction workers who built the mansion, the 2 who died, the dozens who sustained injuries that shortened their working lives, the hundreds who breathed stone dust and metal particulates that would kill them slowly over decades. Did their families receive compensation beyond nominal payments designed to prevent lawsuits? No. Their labor became literally incorporated into the structure, their blood mixed with mortar, their breath mingled with stone dust, their lives consumed in creating beauty they'd never inhabit. This is the mathematics nobody calculates. Caroline Astor operated her social empire for 3 decades by extracting value from people who possessed no alternative. Workers couldn't refuse employment. Starvation awaited those without wages. They couldn't demand better conditions. Infinite replacements lined up behind anyone who complained. They couldn't save enough to escape service. Wages deliberately kept low enough to maintain dependence. The 400 danced above. Thousands worked below. And the system that enabled this required one principle. The people who created the beauty must remain invisible. The moment guests started noticing servants as individuals, as humans with legitimate needs and desires, the fantasy would crack. Mrs. Astor understood this instinctively. Not through cruelty, she wasn't unusually harsh by her class's standards, but through perfect clarity about what maintaining her position required. Any acknowledgement of servants' humanity would undermine the social hierarchy that placed her at its apex. So they remained nameless, faceless, reduced to functions rather than recognized as people. The mansion at 65th Street operated as designed, a machine that transformed human labor into social power, with costs hidden behind elegant facades. Stand today at the corner of 5th Avenue and 65th Street, and you see a modern apartment building. Temple Emmanuel occupies one side of the block, a synagogue built in 1929. Its Byzantine Revival architecture suggesting permanence through spiritual rather than temporal power. The 845th Avenue building still houses residents. Wealthy people living well, though none command the cultural authority Caroline Astor once wielded from this precise location. Tourists pass by without knowing they re-walking round where American high society once concentrated itself with intensity that seems almost foreign to contemporary sensibilities. Is this tragedy or progress? Perhaps both. Caroline Astor represented the apex of Gilded Age social control. One woman determining who existed and who didn't, operating from mansions built specifically to demonstrate and perpetuate her power. The system she perfected concentrated cultural authority in ways that seem almost totalitarian viewed from modern perspective. But she didn't invent the system. She simply mastered it with uncommon skill. The Gilded Age produced dozens of society queens, each commanding their own courts, each maintaining their own guest lists. Caroline distinguished herself through consistency, through strategic brilliance, through willingness to perform the role without wavering for 3 decades. The mansions served as instruments of that performance. First the brownstone, establishing legitimacy through restraint, proving old money credentials. Then the chateau, announcing that restraint phase had ended, that power could now manifest without apology. Both demolished within 40 years of construction, not through revolution or economic collapse, but through simple obsolescence. The social structures they supported evolved beyond needing physical headquarters. Authority fragmented and democratized, becoming more fluid and less easily controlled by single individuals. The mansion at 34th Street vanished beneath the Empire State Building, a structure serving thousands of workers rather than 400 guests. The palace at 65th Street gave way to apartment housing and religious space, uses serving communities rather than celebrating individuals. Something was lost in these transformations. The craftsmanship, undeniably. Italian stonemasons carved details that photographs capture, but buildings no longer contain. French designers created interiors that transported American guests to European palaces. Workers invested skill and care into structures meant to outlast them by centuries. Gone, demolished, reduced to salvage and rubble. But something was also gained. The end of social systems that required one woman's approval for existence. The dispersal of power away from individuals who controlled access through arbitrary judgment. The opening of society to people whose only qualification was wealth. Imperfect democratization, but movement towards something more fluid than rigid hierarchy. Caroline Astor built her empire on invisible labor and exclusionary practices. The empire collapsed not through moral reckoning, but through changing circumstances that made such concentrated authority untenable. The lesson isn't about justice or retribution. It's about impermanence. A final thought to close. The term, the 400, survives long after the ballroom that defined it vanished. We still use it, usually ironically, to describe social elites, the people who matter in particular communities or industries. The 400 of Silicon Valley, the 400 of Hollywood. The phrase persists because Caroline Astor understood something fundamental about human social organization. Scarcity creates value. If everyone can attend, the party means nothing. If only some can attend, and if attendance requires specific qualifications, and if those qualifications are carefully controlled by authorities whose judgment seems simultaneously arbitrary and absolute, then attendance becomes valuable beyond the event itself. She didn't invent exclusion. She perfected it, gave it architectural form, made it visible through mansions whose ballroom capacities literally define society's boundaries. The mansions are gone. The principle remains. Every velvet rope, every members-only club, every invitation-required event operates on logic Caroline Astor codified. Power lies in controlled access, and controlled access requires authorities willing to say no. We've inherited her system while forgetting her name. The 400 dance still, though they don't call themselves that anymore. The mansions that housed them vanished, replaced by apartment buildings and office towers, in spaces serving thousands where hundreds once gathered. But somewhere, in penthouses and private clubs and gated communities, the machinery continues operating. Different locations, different names, different aesthetic codes, same mathematics of exclusion, same invisible workers maintaining fantasies they'll never inhabit, same eventual obsolescence waiting, patient as mathematics, for circumstances to shift and render even the most powerful positions temporarily held. Mrs. Astor's ballroom held exactly 400 people. How many does yours hold? And who's counting?